Welcome viewers. On behalf of Iravati Research and Communication, this is Pratim Ranjan Bose. I have with me Professor Selim Raihan, a noted economist from Bangladesh. Welcome, Dr. Raihan.
Okay.
Dr. Raihan is a professor at the Department of Economics, University of Dhaka, and Executive Director at the South Asian Network of Economic Modeling, or SANEM. We know each other for some time. What I appreciate about him is he doesn't believe in watertight compartments between economics and political economics. Numbers, I do believe, always doesn't tell the truth, particularly about the emerging economies. If I'm not wrong, Professor Raihan wrote in a recent newspaper article that in real life, it is political economics that takes precedence over economics. As a practitioner or as a student of business and economics in real life perspective, I find that appealing. With him around, we will discuss about Bangladesh and India-Bangladesh issues in this edition. On the agenda are current economic status of Bangladesh, the reform opportunities, and his assessments about the prospects of India-Bangladesh Comprehensive Economic Agreement, or SEPA. India, as we know, is moving away from the free trade agreement or FTA regime to SEPA for last 1 decade. The most recent in this list is the comprehensive treaty with the United Arab Emirates. The Sheikh Hasina government in Bangladesh recently decided to start negotiations in this direction. But before we go there, here is a bigger issue at hand. Bangladesh, as we know, is a country of surprises. Dhaka has turned many corners in the past. This time, the surprise came in the wrong way. In May this year, Bangladesh surprised the world by announcing a $200 million currency swap, which is practically a foreign loan to crisis-ridden Sri Lanka, that made it the second country in the region after India to grant such concessions. Barely a month later, reports started flooding in about an imminent shortfall in Bangladesh's foreign exchange reserves and trouble in importing energy commodities. Some reports suggested that the crisis was building since April-May. Things started happening too fast since Bangladesh clamped down on import of even energy essentials, risking import of impact on domestic economy or production. Over the last 2 months, farm and fertilizer price is hiked by 25%, and petroleum product prices, auto fuel, has gone up by nearly 50%. Officially, the currency is devalued by roughly 10% since May. Unofficially, the devaluation is way faster. The spread between official and card market rates was as high as 26% in mid-August. Dhaka has sought budgetary support worth $7.5 billion from IMF and other multilateral agencies to tide over the crisis. The global economy is passing through turbulent times for last 2 years. Lockdown and supply chain disruption had a severe impact on major economies in calendar year 2020. India, US, UK suffered contraction. Australia ended up flat. Just when the world economy started peaking in 2022, there came the Ukraine crisis, followed by that pushed the energy prices, which was already firming up since middle of 2021 due to higher economic activities. But after the Ukraine crisis, it just crossed, it reached record high. That sent inflation through the roof and inviting recessionary trends. US and UK are in contraction mode, as in the last quarter. China has barely avoided that. The net impact was slowdown in exports, widening trade gap, and exit of hot money due to counter-inflationary measures by the US Fed. To sum up, pressure on foreign currency reserve is a common phenomenon in all trade deficit countries. What is striking in the case of Bangladesh is it reported a modest 3.4% growth as per World Bank, even in the COVID year of 2020, marginally down from 3.7% in 2019. Between January and June 2022, when the entire world was feeling high inflationary pressure, Bangladesh was looking comfortable as per official reporting. There was no revision in prices of auto fuel during peak COVID uh, during peak crude price period in April, June, when it breached 10-year high. And most important of all, the country reported record export growth in March and June quarters of 2022. And just when the global crude prices started declining down by roughly 30% from the peak, Bangladesh became unsteady. Surely something was amiss here. To understand that, let's turn to Professor Raihan. Professor, from a growth in COVID year to high export growth in Bangladeshi fiscal year of 2021-22, low inflation, official claim of adequate reserve to the current scenario. Do you see any inconsistency? More precisely, do numbers add up? What do you, sir?
Thank you, Mr. Bose, and thank you for inviting me to this dialogue. Uh, I think the narration you had on the kind of challenges, especially country like Bangladesh is facing, and which are not very uncommon, I would say. Many developing countries, they are facing similar kinds of challenges at this moment. I think you made a kind of very nice depiction of the reality. Uh, so to answer your question, whether you know any kind of inconsistencies are there, I would not say it is a kind of matter of inconsistency. Uh, the country, if you look at the kind of long-term trend of growth and development in Bangladesh, over the last 3 decades or so, I would emphasize more on last 3 decades since the early 90s, especially since when economic reforms started taking place. If you look at this long-term trend, the country made some robust, performances, especially in terms of registering a high economic growth, in terms of achieving some important development, areas in achieving some important achievements, and especially in some important areas, social areas, I would say. Child mortality went down, maternal mortality went down, and some of the areas, for example, female literacy, participation in the labor market, it all increased. So if you compare Bangladesh, after post-independence in 1971, and now for the last 50 years, the country made some very considerable progress. So I would say that, when you take this very kind of longer term perspective and then put it against the kind of very short term shocks and some very powerful shocks, like what we are witnessing now. COVID-19 was a very powerful shock, and also the kind of scenarios what we are witnessing due to the Russia-Ukraine war and the global crisis. These are very short-term shocks which can potentially destabilize the long-term development and growth pattern. One advantage the country has is that these kind of short-term shocks are not very, apart from COVID, I would say COVID was something, it was universal to all countries in the world. So apart from COVID, if you look at these short shocks like Russia-Ukraine or current inflationary pressure, this kind of short-term shock is not something new for the country. It happened in the past too. The issue is to how much time it takes for the country to go back to its normal path. And in the past, we have seen that the country has shown some kind of resilience, that the country has been able to overcome these kind of shocks. Now, coming to this point, coming to this particular time when we are witnessing large supply side shock, especially due to the Russia-Ukraine war, global price hike, recession, and many other things. Uh, and also, Bangladesh is not at the same state where the country it was 20 years back. So every time you face new kind of shocks, new kind of challenges, the scenarios also change. So I would not say that the way country uh, tackled some of those external shocks in the past, the country will be able to do it in the same way now. For example, in the global financial crisis, you remember in 2007, 2008, Bangladesh was not very badly affected. And if you look at the figures on growth, export, and other figures, despite some short-term negative effects, and then the country actually came out of that. Also, if you look at the oil price shocks in the past, time to time, the country was able to adjust to it. But now I think when if 20 years back, the country was less than $1,000 per capita income country. Now it is more than $2,500 per capita income. So structural changes happen in the country. And when you want to uh, move towards a higher income category, or you want to achieve larger development goals, so we know that there are many development goals in front of the country. Especially the country wants to achieve SDGs by 2030. Bangladesh graduated from low-income country to lower middle-income country in 2015. Now he wants to graduate to upper middle-income country by 2030 or 2031. And the government has a vision to become a high-income country by 2041. So all these development goals and targets are there. So the question is whether the country has the kind of capacity at this moment, or the kind of strength or resilience to overcome the current challenges and to uh, go back to the path of achieving those larger development goals. I must also remind you that there is a new challenge which is coming up, especially related to the LDC graduation. In 2026, Bangladesh will officially graduate out from the LDC status. That means, as an LDC, the kind of preferences Bangladesh enjoy in different countries, especially in European Union, even in India, even in Canada and some other countries, those preferences will be gone. In European Union, probably Bangladesh will be able to enjoy for duty-free market access for another 3 years, but after that, it's completely uncertain. So I think all these things, my purpose of telling all these things is that it's not the same Bangladesh what we saw 20, 30 years back. It's a different Bangladesh. Different Bangladesh and different set of challenges as well. So I think that now to approach or to kind of address these challenges, the kind of approach you need to take, it must be very very strong enough, and you need to be the country and the policymakers need to be innovative too. And they because some of the things they did not do in the past, especially I'll come to that point when you ask me about the reform issues, because there are some important reforms should have been taken in the past, especially in many critical economic areas, which we haven't seen that. Uh, so I think these are the kind of challenges, especially not doing reforms on time. There are some question marks, especially whether if we don't do those reforms and now, or if we don't show our commitment to undertake those reforms now, there are risks that these kind of powerful short-term shocks can actually destabilize the long-term development path. So these are the things we are trying to make ourselves clear, and especially highlighting these points when you try to convey this message to the policymakers that when you have the agenda of addressing these challenges, especially the price hike, fuel price hike, uh, kind of global recession, you must do proper homework too, especially look at some of the important areas where you need to undertake reforms. So I think if the country can show its commitment, especially policymakers, that they are ready to undertake these reforms, I think that the resilience would be enhanced, and the country will be able to overcome this kind of short-term shocks relatively well compared to if they don't do it. I think the kind of I sometimes say it's a very serious macro mismatch. Especially probably you would be happy to see some macro indicators doing well, especially growth or export or remittances. But when you look at the social indicators, especially what is happening in the poverty, what is happening in the case of labor market distortion, the serious issue is that we don't have very updated data on what is happening, the poverty status, what is happening in the labor market. So I say that this macro mismatch can turn out to be very serious because policymakers they still may remain in the comfort zone by looking at the macro indicators that probably the country is doing well. But when you try to see that how much sufferings are there for the low income people in terms of not getting right kind of job, not getting high remunerative job, uh, getting stuck in the high informal sector, and also their poverty status are not really getting improving much. I think we need to be very much concerned about the fact that it is not the growth, economic growth or GDP growth that really matters. We need to look at some of the very important social indicators. Over to you, Subodh.
Yeah, I do understand. I mean, and that has been the situation here that Bangladesh is in a very crucial juncture. I mean, normally all the narratives that goes back to the past, but even in India, as you rightly pointed out, when the 2008 financial meltdown happened, I remember the Raghuram Rajan was then the RBI governor. So he said that we were insulated this time, but the next time we won't be. So that's part of the process that we are. And as you grow out of the LDC status, you have to get out of that shell you have created. And Bangladesh had high import barrier uh, for that matter. But these years were also an opportunity to reorganize things. Now, if I, as for example, right at this moment, I see, from common man's perspective, I see no uh, reason why Bangladesh would artificially keep Taka appreciated. I mean, when getting its right anchor would mean a boost to exports and remittances. I mean, I think this is very common understanding that. And second is, for example, the uh, banking sector. Now, banking sector has not been has always been a concern to Bangladesh. But whatever we are seeing, I mean, I don't know, you may tell us better that what development had taken place there. So these are, to be more precise, the areas where Bangladesh should, I mean, I think Bangladesh should undergo reforms in certain segments. You can add up to that.
No, no, Mr. Bose, you are right. Actually, I can add one more area which is extremely critical for when you talk about reform, especially the taxation sector. You rightly pointed about the exchange rate and then the banking sector, and then I'll add the taxation sector as well. Now, on the exchange rate, probably that's the kind of very interesting point we need to discuss and explore. Why, despite that, we know that the currency depreciation helps boost export. Bangladesh maintained or took a strategy of keeping the exchange rate against Taka, dollar exchange rate, stable. If you look at, I actually created a graph and I compared Bangladesh with India, Vietnam, and some other Southeast Asian countries. If we look at Bangladesh's graph, since 2010, 1 year probably sudden, we can see a sudden rise, but then uh, it remained very stable, until the very recent time. But other countries, we could see very large depreciation. Uh,
And
when
we
it
know
comes to the
Japan has a
taxation,
policy of consistent depreciation.
exactly, exactly. So I think for Bangladesh, I think there is the kind of political economy behind it too, keeping that exchange rate kind of stable. One aspect is that the policymakers probably they were more keen to avoid the kind of uncertainty related to the exchange rate because too much fluctuation in the exchange rate, uh, you know, engages policymakers in a way that you need to be very, very watchful about the exchange rate. But they kept it kind of stable, and so they were not really were not that much worried about the exchange rate fluctuations. But I think the second question is what really helped them to keep the exchange rate stable? Because if it can be your expectation, but in reality you may not be able to do that. But the beauty of the exchange rate regime in Bangladesh was that the policymakers were able to do that because we had, despite some year-to-year fluctuations, we had some robust performance from our remittance and export over the last 1.5 decades. So that actually helped the policymakers to continue that policy that whenever central bank saw that there are some issues of exchange rate falling down, they increase the supply of dollar in the market, and they had the ability to do that. Now they don't have the ability to do that. That's why we can see that there is a huge difference between the official exchange rate and also the exchange rate in the unofficial market. Uh, until recent time, if you look at the last 10 years, the difference between unofficial and official rate was not that great. That means that the supply of US dollar was kind of enough to meet the demand. Uh, so that was one thing. But the point is that despite all these things, we actually did many studies that the exchange rate kept appreciating. And it was even what was more important was the real effective exchange rate. It was appreciating. And that is not really helpful for the export orientation. Uh, Now, why the export? Why we did not see much demand from the export sectors to depreciate the currency? You know that our export basket is dominated by ready-made garments. Around 85% of our export basket is ready-made garments. So for the ready-made garments, though they mentioned sometime, but they were not, in my view, actually, I wrote about it, and it was more of the political economy story, that they were not really very serious about having very large depreciation of the exchange rate. And you know the reason? The reason is that uh, the ready-made garments export is heavily dependent on the import of raw materials. So they were not that keen that if the exchange rate is heavily depreciates, that means that they will incur high rise in cost in importing raw materials. So they knew that it's a kind of a double-edged sword that if you depreciate the currency, that is going to cost them by reducing their competitiveness, in the imported raw materials, and use that in their export sector. And in any way, ready-made garments industry was benefited or compensated because there was a loss in that definitely, especially with an appreciated exchange rate. They are compensated by different subsidies or different kinds of support measures from the government. So that's why we did not see the kind of a strong voice from the ready-made garments to go for it, to have the currency depreciation. And you know that ready-made garments is a very strong lobby. They have a strong lobby in Bangladesh. If they were serious about it, I think they would have been able to influence the policymakers much, and probably we have seen the currency large, time to time regular depreciation in the past. But we didn't see that. But what is happening to other export-oriented sectors? Those who are not really heavily dependent on imported raw materials, they are adding mostly the local validations in their export. They don't have much voice. They are not really organized. So if you look at the leather sector, it's a highly potential sector, but they were not being able to, raise their voice. Though they were mentioning quite many times, but they are not able to raise their voice or making any significant dent on the policymaking process.
In
So
fact,
I
your
think that was
services
the kind
sector should also suffer. IT services.
of course. No, of course, they were suffering definitely, but a large part of the services sectors, IT sectors, they actually operate through very informal arrangements. It's not something very, formal transaction. I'm not quite sure. I might be wrong, but how many of the freelancers in Bangladesh they are registered, and the kind of transaction that take place? It's not. We don't have that kind of information. So there are registered, but it is referred that there are many unregistered freelancers, who don't really want to probably identify, don't want to be identified that the kind of services they are doing, and they are earning money through services export. So yes, of course, I think these are the challenges, when it comes to exchange rate. Now coming to your banking sector, it's another important area where the country needed reform for long. I think it's kind of over very long-standing, overdue. The kind of reform should have been there, especially very high non-performing loan, and that leads to very high interest rate because the banks are not able to recover the loans, and it is actually adding cost to the banking sector. And how to recover the cost? You increase the interest rate. So to avoid that, to address that, in April 2020, actually during the Corona, just beginning of the Corona time, COVID time, government introduced a very, I would say, very strong policy of keeping the exchange rate fixed. So 6% interest rate on deposit and 9% on the lending rate.
Right.
So in Bangla we call it noy choy or
Mm.
choy noy. So 6% 9%. So you know the problem. So the idea was that I think it was a novel idea. It was the intention was good to provide capital to the investors at a lower interest rate. But the problem is when the banking sector has built-in high cost because of very high performing, non-performing loans and inefficiency, even if you fix the interest rate at low, that means you are actually introducing what you call the credit rationing. Not all sectors will be benefited from this low interest rate or fixed interest rate. Only the sectors who have good connections with the banking sector or they have established businesses, they are kind of benefited. So you can keep a large section of the small and medium enterprises or micro enterprises. They are actually outside of the benefit of the banking sector. But despite all these limitations, I would say what, probably when you look at the banking sector in Bangladesh and look at some of the irregulatory scams. And I want to remind you that it's not only in Bangladesh, but many developing countries, these kind of scams happen
No,
in
no,
the banking
scams
sector.
are part of
Even in
life
India,
everywhere.
yeah, exactly,
Of
even in India.
course. No,
So
no,
we have
why
seen that.
2008 meltdown happened because of subprime, and the subprime is
Exactly,
nothing but a scam.
exactly,
So,
exactly, exactly. So, but my point is that I have written it in my paper, and this kind of political economy story behind the banking sector is that despite all these limitations, despite all these irregularities, the banking sector did actually I would say, two good things, or they were able to do two good things. One thing is that they were actually supporting two major growth drivers anyway, the ready-made garments and the remittance. So the banking sector was not dysfunctional when it comes to the operation or providing services to these two important growth drivers, ready-made garments exporters and the remittance senders. So that is the one thing. And second thing is that that it's not a conventional banking system, but in the financial sector, the microfinance through the large operation of the NGOs, and which is under the broad umbrella of definitely our financial sector, that actually went to the very grassroots level, and that actually helped, in various ways, elevation of poverty, engaging women into the economic activities, and women's labor market participation, poverty alleviation, and definitely contributing to economic development too. And we also witnessed in the last 2 or 3 decades a very large, very strong, expansion of non-farm economic activities in the rural areas, and which you can relate to various microfinance activities, and also the remittance inflow of remittances too. So I think these are the related to the banking sector. Now the third area, which is the taxation, I think this is extremely important because Bangladesh has one of the lowest tax GDP ratio in the world. It is around 9%. And with this very low tax GDP ratio, you can't actually spend on very important areas, especially when it comes to spending on education, spending on health, spending on social protection. That's why you probably see that the country is spending around 2% of GDP on public spending, on education, less than 1% of GDP on the health, and around 1.5% of GDP on the social protection, which are completely, I would say, very, very far away from the what the country should spend to achieve some of the larger development goals.
thanks.